Labiotech was in the Northern Ireland capital of Belfast recently. It might have a rich history related to the ocean, and there are definitely a lot of Titanic references around, but it does have a rapidly growing biotech sector. Of course, most biotech hubs have great academic institutions as well, and Belfast is no different. So we came out to Queen's University to see one of the many things that the university is doing in the life sciences arena, and this conversation is based around tackling antimicrobial resistance.
I'm José Bengoechea. I am professor of molecular microbiology at the Wellcome Wolfson Institute for Experimental Medicine. And then one of the major health problems that we have globally is the antibiotic resistant infections. So this is a really global pandemic in every single country of the world. Now in our hospitals, patients are dying or they stay more time in the hospital just because the antibiotics are not working. So in my lab, we're specifically working with one of these microbes, which is Klebsiella pneumoniae, which causes annually at least more than 250,000 deaths associated to Klebsiella infection. So then in my lab, we're trying to understand how this microbe is able to survive in our tissues, why our defenses are not able to clear the infection. And then based on this knowledge, we are developing new therapies in which we prevent or we're aiming to block what Klebsiella does in our defenses, such way that then our immune system will be competent to clear the infection. So we are well advanced already in this journey to find new therapeutics, and then we have already found a drug that can be used. So we have completed all the preclinical work, and then we are really excited that to hopefully within few months we can start the first clinical trial trying to use this drug instead of using antibiotics or together with antibiotics to limit Klebsiella infections.
Right. What's the main issue? Is it that it's resistant, or is it just that we have a problem in getting rid of it once we have it?
Actually, it's both things. So the first issue is that we are not able to get rid of the infection, and then of course when a patient gets infected, then we start to treat it, and then even within the same patient the microbe will become resistant to the treatment. So actually it's happening both things. The microbe is competent to prevent the activation of our defenses, knows how to fight back, but also once we start treating, then we're not efficient because the antibiotics are not really working, or even within the patient we start to get microbes that start to be resistant to the treatment.
Is this a bacterium that in the past could have been treated with drugs, or is it just something that it doesn't really respond to drugs?
No, actually, let's say at the beginning of the golden era that antibiotics were working, still Klebsiella was one of the typical infections that we were able to treat without any problems. But I think from kind of at least 10 to 12 years ago, this is becoming more and more a problem because the microbe is really adapting to be resistant to the antibiotics. So as I said, let's say 20 years ago, it was not that a big problem. The antibiotics were working. 10, 15 years ago, we started to have the problem, and now it's a really, really, really big problem everywhere in the world.
And is this a microbe that's quite common?
It is. So actually, it is interesting. First, we can find it in the environment, but from the environment we don't pick it. But on the other hand, many of us in the Western countries or even in Asia, we may carry this microbe in our gut, and we're healthy without any problems, asymptomatic, but then something may happen. We may have depression, or we have stress, or we may have other disease, other underlying condition, or even some antibiotic treatment for something else, and then Klebsiella may disseminate from our gut to the other tissues, and then we have the infection. So before that was not recognized as one of the main clinical problems, and now we know that actually we are kind of the carriers already potentially of the bug.
And how is it recognized once it spreads from the gut? I mean, how would you know that it was causing an issue?
Normally you are in the hospital already, and then you have symptoms, and then the clinical colleagues will detect the Klebsiella in your blood or in your lung. So, but then you are already in the hospital, so you are already kind of sick.
All right. So it is a big issue because
it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. And so with antimicrobial resistance, I think, is it something that is being taken seriously enough? I spoke to somebody a couple of months ago who was saying that because it's not as high profile as cancer, even though it's killing a lot of people, it doesn't get taken quite as seriously.
So on the one hand, it is interesting what you have mentioned about cancer, because nowadays we are able kind of, I will not say to cure cancer, but we're quite successful. But then what is interesting, in most of the cases, the cancer treatment is based on prophylactic antibiotic treatment. So, and in many cases, in our hospitals, we're able to treat cancer patients, but then they become infected with Klebsiella, and then we're not able to treat it. And then these patients actually, they are dying. So, we're able to cure the cancer of the patient or even control the cancer, but then they become infected, and then we're not able to treat that, and actually they die due to the infection. And this is something that is kind of really, really crazy. So in terms, I think all the governments and the major funding agencies, they are well aware of the EMR problem. And there is investment, but certainly it's not enough. And I do agree with you, they don't take it perhaps seriously enough. They don't realize the health problem that we are facing. So we really need perhaps less talking and more action.
And what are the ways to tackle antimicrobial resistance? Is it through more antibiotics or different antibiotics, or are there other ways that we can treat it other than antibiotics?
So, being a complex problem as it is, there is no, let's say, single perfect solution. On the one hand, at least in the UK and similar Western countries, already it is important that we control when we give antibiotics to patients or not, so that is essential. We have nearly completely reduced the use of antibiotics in farming, and that should be zero, so it's not even low, should be zero, and we're going in the right direction. But then in terms of what we can do, as I said, it's complex, and there are many, well, there are few options that are already under investigation. On the one hand, developing more antibiotics, but personally I think this is perhaps not the winning strategy. This will give us some time, but I don't think, if something has demonstrated history, is that actually the microbe will become resistant to them. So something that is really becoming more and more interesting now is vaccines, because they do work against these infections, and there is a lot of research even by pharma to develop vaccines against these infections. And then the last, I think there are two other approaches that are still under investigation, but I think they are getting traction, is the use of viruses that will target bacteria, the use of phage therapy, and I think this is more and more an avenue that perhaps within few years will be in clinical use. And then, for example, what we're using in my lab, which is try to using the approach of what it is called host-directed therapeutics, in which we don't target the pathogen, we prevent what the pathogen is doing in our body with a drug, and then that will make that our defenses will be competent to clear the infection. Interestingly enough, in this approach, some of the drugs that we are using, actually they are already in clinical use to treat cancer or to treat Alzheimer. So that means we know they are safe, we know that they do work, meaning that if they do work in the context of infection, and our research is demonstrating that this is the case, we bypass the clinical development and the cost of that by nearly 75%, meaning that we can go from the lab to the patient and clinical use in less than in 5 to 6 years, which is by far much more quicker than developing a new antibiotic.
Right. And how far, you said you're looking at doing clinical trials?
So hopefully it depends on some stakeholders coming together, at least what we are doing in the lab. So within 24 months, we should be in a position to run the first clinical trial.
And will that be here, or will it just be could be anywhere?
Certainly could be anywhere, but in the way that we are designing the trial, so certainly will be done part in Belfast, but most likely we'll need to do it at least UK wide. So then it will be different big hospitals of the country taking part on it.
And is it just a university study, or will there be partners from industry?
So we need to have one partner for industry because we are going to just one drug that is in clinical use for something else. So this is where the negotiations are taking a bit longer, but certainly it is done with an industrial partner.
Right. And are there any other things that you're working on, or is this the main one?
So this is the project that we have more advanced, that we are nearly really close to the clinical practice. We have a different of other targets that we have also drugs that we can use, but then other element that we are quite excited now, as I have told you before, we are the carrier of Klebsiella. So then one idea would be if we try to prevent or to limit being us the carriers of the infection, then we will eliminate part of the problem. So we have started a big program, try to understand much better how come Klebsiella is able to survive in our gut, which should not be there, and this is there. And then secondly, how to prevent that one. And the approach that we are going to take most likely will be to use some sort of probiotics, because based on the evidence that we have, that might be a newly designed probiotic might help to prevent Klebsiella being in our gut, and then therefore we will not have infections later on.
Is it something that's beneficial to the gut until it gets out of control?
So certainly, if you don't control Klebsiella, it may become, for example, in patients with colitis or Crohn's disease, Klebsiella is one of the main problems in many infections in the gut. So if you don't control that, then it may have other consequences. But certainly, in the context of the normal human gut, to remove Klebsiella will have no consequences, neither good neither bad in that sense. We will prevent late subsequent infections, but in terms of whether your life will be affected, it will not. You will be as healthy as you were before.
Okay. Are there any sort of commercial considerations in this? I mean, is there the potential to spin this out into a company? Or?
That is a good. There is potential to do that, but personally, since this is a really big global health problem, I always try to make everything as accessible as possible. Of course, everything is published, so you can read the work there. Some things may be protected, the intellectual property, but certainly we try to do it as open as possible and as accessible as possible. Always when you try, of course you can spin out a company, but certainly when you do that, it will take longer time to go to the clinics than if you partner with a big pharma already since the beginning, because then you will do it faster. And here the point is not to become rich, actually is to prevent these infections that are killing hundreds of thousands of people every year, which is the goal that I have.
Right. Are there other people in different labs working on similar?
So here in the institute, we have virologists that they have been instrumental working in COVID-19, and they have been also working to try to find drugs that we can use as a tablet to treat COVID-19 infections. We have colleagues working in respiratory pathogens that are important in the context of smoking associated diseases. So that is a complex environment, and then these colleagues are not only working from the bacterial side, but then they are working try to prevent or try to control the inflammation of the lung, that will be beneficial to limit these kind of infections. So in the institute we have sort of a global, no, kind of a general program by different labs working in different aspects of infections and humans.